Xi Jinping didn't lose Southeast Asia with a war. He lost it with a handshake. From April 14th to 18th, Xi launched a Grand Charm Offensive, a tour designed to showcase China's leadership, to remind the world that Beijing, not Washington, set the rules of engagement in the Indo-Pacific. The ceremonies were flawless. State banquets, lavish welcomes, red carpets rolled across Hanoi, Kuala Lumpur, and Phnom Penh. But behind every photo op, something far more dangerous was unfolding. In Vietnam, Xi signed 45 agreements. Infrastructure, technology, trade. On paper, it was a triumph. In reality, a polite rejection. The deals were lopsided, China giving, Vietnam receiving, and no real commitment in return. No ironclad military pacts, no anti-American statements, no strategic pledges. And just 3 days after Xi departed, Vietnam's Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh stood before American executives, calling the U.S.-Vietnam relationship special, unlike any other. The optics were brutal. A red carpet one day, pivot westward the next. And Vietnam wasn't alone. Malaysia played host with grand fanfare, but within days, leaks surfaced. Malaysia Aviation Group was preparing to absorb cancelled Boeing orders, a direct shot at Beijing's trade war leverage. Meanwhile, back-channel meetings with U.S. trade envoys intensified. Publicly, Malaysia maintained its neutrality. Privately, it was hedging its bets, and not in China's favor. Then came Cambodia. Long considered a puppet of Beijing, Cambodia delivered one of the harshest blows. After China funded the massive renovation of Ream Naval Base, after the billions poured into infrastructure, after the weapons and grants, Cambodia, without warning, welcomed Japanese warships to dock at Ream. An open ceremony, flags flying, photos beamed across international news. No explanation, no apology, just a silent statement. You no longer own this board. Even Singapore, China's long-standing economic partner, was shifting. Ho Ching, the influential former CEO of Temasek and former First Lady, reposted a brutal editorial calling Xi Jinping a mob boss who squandered China's influence. Singapore didn't abandon China publicly. It didn't need to. Behind closed doors, shipping inspections tightened. Technology transfers slowed. Sensitive exports were rerouted, away from Beijing's grasp. The pivot wasn't explosive. It was surgical. Each country moved quietly, cautiously. No grand declarations, no burned bridges, just recalibrations, one by one. And Xi Jinping, the man who once choreographed China's global ascent, now found himself presiding over a stage where even his closest players were slipping into the wings. He had built influence with money. He had demanded loyalty through dependence. But when the tides shifted, when Washington offered alternative lifelines, his allies remembered something Beijing had forgotten. Money can build bridges, but trust keeps them standing. The ceremonies continued, the speeches echoed, but the foundations had cracked. And by the time Beijing noticed, the exodus was already underway. Not loudly, not with banners, but with footsteps fading into the distance. Loyalty Beijing thought could be bought. Port here, a highway there, a few billion in soft loans. For a time it worked, but loyalty built on leverage has a fatal flaw. The moment a better option appears, it vanishes. And that's exactly what's happening now. Even China's oldest, most trusted partners, the so-called Iron Friends, are stepping quietly but decisively away. Cambodia, the poster child of China's Belt and Road expansion, had every reason to stay loyal. Billions invested, naval bases funded, political backing in international forums. And yet, after Xi Jinping's grand visit, after the carefully staged ceremonies, 2 Japanese warships pulled into Ream Naval Base without hesitation. It wasn't just a diplomatic slight. It was a declaration. We are not locked in, and China couldn't stop it, because money had bought access, not allegiance. Singapore followed a different path, but delivered the same message. While China lavished Singapore with trade deals and investments, the island state quietly moved to protect its own future. Ho Ching's public criticism of Xi Jinping wasn't a random post. It was a crack in the facade. Behind the scenes, Singapore tightened restrictions on sensitive exports to China, screened financial flows, repositioned itself toward US-led security frameworks without ever saying it out loud. They smiled at Beijing and quietly walked toward Washington. Even Malaysia, historically cautious, adjusted its compass. Negotiations with Boeing, trade expansion with the United States, new compliance standards for port inspections, aimed at cutting down Chinese origin laundering. None of it screamed abandonment, but every move said the same thing. We're preparing for a world where Beijing isn't at the center. South Korea offered another glimpse into the quiet revolt. Customs authorities exposed $21 million worth of Chinese goods fraudulently labeled as Korean in just the first quarter of 2025. Instead of turning a blind eye, Seoul cracked down hard. Public investigations, prosecutions, new safeguards on export certifications. Why? Because Seoul wasn't willing to jeopardize its $130 billion trade relationship with Washington just to cover for Beijing's evasions. And then there was Thailand. Long adept at walking tightropes, Bangkok issued one of the region's strongest signals, flagging 42 product lines for Chinese origin fraud, tightening customs enforcement in direct coordination with U.S. trade representatives. No one declared open rebellion. No one tore up treaties. But the moves were clear: risk mitigation, diversification, silent disengagement. The world wasn't turning against China because of ideology. It was turning because of calculation. In a global system now prioritizing resilience over price, China's political volatility had become a liability no amount of infrastructure funding could offset. And Xi Jinping, once the master of backroom deals and soft coercion, was discovering an uncomfortable truth. You can't force a seat at the table when everyone else has quietly built a new one across the room. The era of polite compliance was ending. The era of quiet revolt had begun. And the more Beijing demanded loyalty, the more its former allies realized. They didn't need to say no. They just needed to walk away. Silently, irreversibly, China once spun an invisible web around the world. Ports, loans, trade routes, pipelines. From Africa to Latin America, from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe, Beijing's influence expanded like a tide. No need for wars, no need for occupations, just contracts, construction crews, and quiet promises. We'll build your future. Just stay close. For years it worked, but now, strand by strand, that web is unraveling. Not with explosions, not with declarations, but with quiet acts of self-preservation. The collapse began in Southeast Asia and spread outward. Africa was next. Countries once proud to join the Belt and Road were waking up to hard truths. Debt traps, corruption scandals, projects stalled or abandoned halfway. In Kenya, the $3.6 billion Nairobi-Mombasa Railway, once hailed as a BRI triumph, became a financial burden so heavy that policymakers quietly sought restructuring assistance from Western lenders. In Zambia, default on Chinese debt forced emergency negotiations, with terms far harsher than initially promised. Even in Ethiopia, where China's investment once built gleaming skylines, protests broke out over land seizures linked to Chinese-backed projects. The message was spreading. Beijing doesn't build futures, it builds dependencies. Latin America began adjusting next. Argentina, drowning in debt, sought IMF support over expanding Chinese ties. Brazil, long touted as a BRICS anchor, diversified its technology supply chains toward Europe and the US, reducing exposure to Chinese telecom giants. Chile and Peru, key mining hubs, reviewed their agreements with Chinese firms amid fears of resource exploitation. The quiet recalibration was underway. Even Eastern Europe, which once welcomed Chinese investment as a hedge against Brussels and Washington, shifted course. The so-called 17+1 cooperation platform between China and Central/Eastern Europe crumbled. By 2025, only 12 countries remained. And of those, several, including Lithuania, Estonia, and the Czech Republic, had already pivoted firmly toward NATO and the EU. The web was tearing at every connection point. Meanwhile, China's own vulnerabilities were being exposed faster than Beijing could patch them. Wall Street wasn't waiting. Private capital flight from China accelerated, not with panic, but with cold strategy. Funds redirected to India's booming industrial corridors, Vietnam's emerging manufacturing hubs, Eastern European logistics networks designed to bypass Eurasian choke points. In the tech world, supply chain managers weren't talking about decoupling anymore. They were acting on it. Semiconductor alliances hardened around Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Battery production diversified into Europe and Southeast Asia. Rare earth mineral supply lines rerouted through Australia, Canada, and Africa, skipping Chinese refineries altogether. Even in finance, trust was fading. Insurance premiums for China-related trade deals soared. Global risk models quietly shifted, treating Chinese exposure as an unstable strategic liability. Multinational corporations, once proud of their China footprints, started sanitizing earnings reports, minimizing references to Chinese operations to avoid shareholder backlash. All without press releases, all without protest marches, just disappearance. A great web that had once seemed unbreakable, now hanging in tatters, shredded by 1,000 small, calculated exits. And Beijing's response? More threats, more promises, more empty declarations of opening up, but no real trust building. Because in geopolitics, as in business, trust isn't declared. It's earned or lost. And China in 2025 was learning you can command compliance for a time, but you can't command loyalty once the future is at stake. Across continents, across industries, across governments, the network was slipping away. Not loudly, not with anger, just a quiet acknowledgement. We can't afford to be tied down when the ship is sinking. Xi Jinping once envisioned a world interconnected through Beijing's will. Today, that vision lies fractured. The world isn't turning against China out of hatred. It's simply choosing not to be caught in the collapse. Piece by piece, link by link, the web that was meant to secure China's future is now unraveling faster than anyone in Zhongnanhai dares to admit. The cracks weren't isolated. They triggered chain reactions, one after another. And by the time Beijing realized it, the global markets had already started locking China out. Quietly, methodically, and without fanfare. It began with trust, or rather, the collapse of it. Supply chains, once built for efficiency, now pivoted toward resilience. No longer did multinational corporations chase the cheapest bids out of Shenzhen or Guangzhou. They chased stability, predictability, freedom from geopolitical risk. Vietnam became the new hub for electronics, India for pharmaceuticals, Mexico for industrial assembly lines. New routes formed, East Africa to Europe through revamped ports, South America directly to U.S. coasts, bypassing Pacific intermediaries, ASEAN corridors connecting to the Indo-Pacific framework, all designed with one quiet objective: reduce China exposure. Insurance premiums told the real story. Trade insurers recalibrated policies in early 2025. Cargo bound to or routed through China now required higher risk surcharges. Not because of immediate sanctions, not because of war, but because supply chain integrity could no longer be guaranteed. At first, companies absorbed the cost. Then CFOs started asking harder questions. If a $100 million shipment gets caught in a new round of export restrictions, who absorbs the loss? By mid-2025, answers were coming in. Not us. Procurement officers restructured contracts. Logistics firms rerouted cargo chains. Banks adjusted lending terms for China-exposed businesses. In boardrooms across New York, London, Tokyo, China transformed from growth opportunity to contingency liability, and that shift unleashed a domino effect far beyond trade. Financial flows started freezing. Foreign direct investment into China, once flowing at hundreds of billions per year, dried up to its lowest level since 2007. Not because of formal bans, because of exit strategies. Multinationals sold stakes in joint ventures. Private equity firms divested from mainland portfolios. Tech companies relocated R&D hubs to Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. The world wasn't trying to cripple China. It was trying to protect itself. Meanwhile, semiconductor wars escalated behind the scenes. The US, Japan, the Netherlands, key players in chip manufacturing, tightened export controls again. Tools for advanced fabrication, critical materials for photolithography, software licenses for electronic design. Each move created new bottlenecks inside China's supply ecosystem. Each move forced Chinese firms to scramble for alternatives, often at higher cost, lower quality, and longer lead times. And it didn't stop at semiconductors. Green tech, batteries, solar panels, EV components, once seen as China's next global dominance play, now faced stiff new resistance. New EU policies mandated non-Chinese critical mineral sourcing for battery subsidies. The US launched tax credits conditional on non-Chinese EV supply chains. Investors took notice. Capital flowed into mining projects in Australia, Canada, South America. New refineries popped up in Europe and Southeast Asia. And all of it quietly, methodically pushed China further outside the emerging supply networks of the 21st century. Even data flows began to decouple. Cloud computing alliances rerouted traffic. Telecom equipment audits expanded. Security reviews labeled Chinese hardware as critical vulnerabilities rather than standard components. The world was not cutting China off with declarations. It was simply building a parallel system without Beijing at the center. And China? Beijing issued the usual statements, threatening countermeasures, promising retaliation, accusing the West of economic bullying. But the world wasn't waiting for ultimatums anymore. It was moving on, slowly, relentlessly, like a tide receding from a shore long taken for granted. The final humiliation wasn't loud. It didn't come with protests or embargoes. It came with the cold calculations of markets. If we can't guarantee stability through China anymore, we'll build stability without it. Xi Jinping had imagined a future where China was the indispensable hub of global trade and finance. Instead, the world was quietly cutting new paths, leaving Beijing in the center of a shrinking, increasingly isolated network. The chain reactions had already begun, and like any true domino fall once set in motion, they were impossible to reverse. In chess, there's a moment when the board is already lost, but the losing player keeps moving pieces, hoping for a mistake that never comes. That's where Xi Jinping stands today. The world isn't confronting him directly. It isn't fighting him in public. It's simply moving on, building new alliances, new supply chains, new futures without Beijing at the center. And the tragic part? She can see it, but he can't stop it. Not anymore. The tools that once made China unstoppable, investment leverage, trade dominance, diplomatic pressure, have lost their edge. Investment leverage? Countries now view Chinese loans with suspicion. Belt and road projects are stalled, renegotiated, or quietly canceled. In Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, the red carpets have faded. Leaders shake hands with Chinese envoys, and then sign separate agreements with Washington, Tokyo, or Brussels behind closed doors. Trade dominance? Global corporations have diversified. Ports once bustling with China-bound cargo now split shipments among India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico. It didn't take sanctions. It didn't take military confrontation. It only took one realization. If we can build a future without being dependent on China, why wouldn't we? Diplomatic pressure? Gone too. When Beijing threatens economic retaliation now, the response is often quiet indifference. Countries have hedged. They have exit strategies. The fear of Chinese reprisal, once a powerful weapon, has eroded. Even longtime friends like Pakistan, Cambodia, and Serbia are no longer fully predictable. Behind every strategic partnership photo op, there's a backup plan, one that doesn't include Beijing's dominance. The board has changed, and Xi's options have shrunk. At home, the story isn't much better. Manufacturing is slowing. Exports are faltering. Foreign investment is bleeding out. Yet state media clings to old slogans. New era. Win-win cooperation. Community of shared destiny. Destiny, however, has moved on. Even Chinese tech giants, once engines of soft power, are finding doors closed overseas. Bans on Chinese telecoms equipment. Restrictions on Chinese-owned apps. Security reviews labeling Chinese tech as high risk. And Beijing's countermoves? Ineffective. Retaliatory sanctions that hurt its own exporters. Diplomatic protests ignored by European parliaments. Trade shows in China attended by fewer and fewer serious buyers. No one needs to declare a new Cold War, because China's isolation isn't ideological. It's structural. A global realignment has begun, and China is increasingly outside the new architecture. Supply chains, energy corridors, financial systems, technology ecosystems, all are recalibrating without Beijing's central role. In the past, she might have been able to pull a masterstroke. A grand initiative, a dazzling investment offer, a massive infrastructure pledge to win back influence. Not now, because the collapse isn't about losing power. It's about losing trust. And trust, once shattered, is harder to rebuild than any airport, bridge, or port. The final move has already been played not by China, but by the world. The pieces are still on the board. China still has weight. It still matters. But it no longer dictates the tempo. It no longer sets the rules. The world isn't attacking China. The world has simply stopped waiting for it, stopped needing it to move first, stopped orbiting around it. And in the silence that follows, Xi Jinping, once the mastermind of China's global rise, now stands alone, the last piece left on a board everyone else has already abandoned. It's not collapse through fire. It's not collapse through war. It's collapse through irrelevance. And no amount of rhetoric, no flurry of trade fairs or diplomatic missions can change what's already happened. China is no longer the inevitable future. It's the fading memory of a past the world quietly chose to outgrow. The isolation is complete, not because the world hates China, but because the world doesn't need it anymore. The board is silent now. No more grand moves, no more sweeping victories, just a solitary figure, standing among pieces that no longer matter. Xi Jinping once played to reshape the global order. Now, the world is playing a different game, on a different board, where China isn't even seated. The final question isn't whether China can recover. It's whether it even realizes it's already been left behind. When power fades not with confrontation, but with quiet dismissal, what choices are left for a leader who once believed the world would wait forever? Tell me, is China facing a temporary setback, or has the real game already moved on, leaving Beijing chasing shadows? Drop your thoughts below. Let's dive deeper into the unraveling.